Ladies and gentlemen, on transitional and post-release support, for the introductory remarks, we're very privileged to have with us today Peter Murphy. Peter is the founding principal of Noetic Solutions, and he has substantial experience in developing practical solutions to intricate organisational issues. He's done a lot of work for government, most particularly for an audience like us. He worked for the New South Wales government on their juvenile justice report. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Peter Murphy.
Thank you, Frank, and since you're far taller than I am, I will definitely be sitting down after my 2 minutes. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I was speaking with Graham West at lunch, and he said my observation as well, I think, is that we're all very much in furious agreement today, which is great. But what I'd like to do is to talk to you about the back end of the justice argument. Picture, if you will, your typical Hollywood prison movie. A man, and it's invariably a man, steps outside of a big gate, and the door shuts behind him. He's in a very ill-fitting clothes, and he has a brown paper bag of his possessions. Invariably, he goes on to bigger and better things in the course of that movie. But of course, our experience tells us that that's not always the case in Australia's justice system. And so what I want to talk about is how do we actually get better outcomes from when that person, whether it's a child or a young person or a man or a woman, steps outside the gates of one of our institutions. There's three things that I'd like to cover off with you if I could. The first is, what do we talk about when we talk about through care or post-release? Some observations from the work that my company's done, particularly in New South Wales, in the Australian Capital Territory, the Northern Territory and Queensland, with through care, and then finally some observations on what we might do differently in the future. The final thing that I'll be doing is issuing a bit of a challenge, which I think might be a useful thing for us to discuss after we've heard from the rest of the panel. So what do we mean by through care? And I'll use through care as the definition because that's what I'm comfortable with using. Well, for a start, there is no universally accepted definition or approach to this, which I think is most unfortunate. But Stephen Covey, who sort of read one of his many books, his book, The 7 Effective Habits of People, the first one is that start with the end in mind. And I think that's what actually summarises really good through care, is that at the beginning of somebody's sentence, we're thinking about that end, about what it will look like at the end and for them. But so some of the work that we did in the Northern Territory, one of the NGOs up there had a very good definition, which I'd like to sort of paraphrase and read to you, because I think it sums it up very nicely. They see it as motivating and supporting the rehabilitation of detainees and prisoners while incarcerated, and providing positive pathways on release to support successful reintegration in the community as law-abiding citizens, to help reduce recidivism and realisation of safer communities. Why do I like that definition? I think because there's a couple of elements to it. One, it's about the person when they're being detained, and about how we can actually get them started in there. And the second thing is that there's a benefit statement in there for the community, and that is a reduction in recidivism and safer communities. So I think that's a good thing. That said, the best through care programs in the world aren't silver bullets. By the very nature of what we're talking about here, we're actually dealing with a wicked problem. There will always be crime of some type going on in the world, but it's what we do about it which is important. So how are we going? Well, we're probably not going as well as we might, I suppose, as you might describe it. There are a number of good pockets around the place of things being done, and I was very pleased to hear Deputy Commissioner Rod Wise's words this morning about how he's working with his people here in Victoria to get them focused on that. And I think that's a very good thing. But overall, I don't think that we're doing particularly well here in Australia. And the evidence for that is, as we've probably seen today, over the last decade we've had a 15% increase in the prison population, and I'll be the first to admit that there are a whole range of reasons for that. But certainly recidivism is part of that. So we're not actually reducing the numbers of people who are offending. There is no common approach nationally, as I mentioned earlier. When we look at the programs that we've been, in the jurisdictions we've been asked to look at, what have we seen? Well, firstly, that there's a combination of government and NGO providers in here. They're not very well aligned in the instances that we've looked at. In fact, they're quite disjointed. The application of these programs is very uneven. So, for instance, in the Northern Territory, you have some programs being given to Indigenous offenders in Darwin, but not in Alice Springs. With many of the post-release programs, there's a very strong metropolitan focus. So those offenders in regional or remote areas are often very much missed out. Funding is poor, and it's also very unreliable. Some of the programs that we looked at on behalf of the Federal Attorney General were funded for 3 years, which was a good length of time, but only as a one-off because the funding came out of the proceeds of crime bucket of money, which is a very uneven funding. But one thing that we did notice that was very positive is that there are very dedicated people working in an absolute shoestring trying to put these services in. Our belief is that if we're not actually doing a lot at the front end and we're talking about the diversion end, that this is a good place to spend money. And I think there's a good lot of evidence to say that if we invest in helping to rehabilitate or to set up people for success when they get out into the community, we're spending our money relatively wisely. The other thing that we've also noticed from our work is that on release we are doing very little to actually help address the underlying causes of crime. And one of the ones that we like to focus on is mental health. Mental health, as you'd mostly be, or many of you be aware, is a major contributor for a whole range of reasons to criminal activity. And I reflect on Leonard's words, I think, this morning about the issue with alcohol and drugs. By the fact that we don't actually address those issues, we simply keep or allow people to continue offending. So what might we do about this in the future? I'd position 5 things for your consideration. Firstly, we need a coherent national approach to this. And for someone that's based in Canberra and does a lot of work for the Commonwealth Government, I'm sure you're not surprised that I would say something like that. But I think that unless we have a national approach, we will have the same situation we're at the moment, where we have a lot of well-intentioned but very disjointed approaches to this, both in the youth and the correction systems. This needs to be evidence-based, based on that for the needs of the individuals, but also for the programs. Our view is that there are far too many programs out there, some which are very much unevaluated, others which are very much underfunded, and the most successful are starved of funds and not given and not supported as well as they should be. Approaches and programs need to be tailored to the jurisdiction that you're in, whether it's metropolitan, regional or remote areas. There's no silver bullet, as I mentioned earlier. One area where we do need to do a lot of tailoring is for Indigenous Australians, particularly Indigenous young Australians. 50% on average in each jurisdiction of kids who are locked up are Indigenous. Just about every single one of them will go on to the corrections system. That, I think, is totally unacceptable. We need to do much better, and programs which are tailored to try and reduce that need to be put in place, in our view. As I mentioned earlier, we also need at the very beginning to plan what we're going to do, and I think forget who one of the speakers this morning mentioned this, about having detailed, comprehensive plans so that we've got something to go forward with. So the individual, whether it's a child or a young person or adult, has a plan that they can work through for the period of their detention. Going down to a very tactical level, one thing that we've seen that we believe very strongly of is the importance of a single case manager. And we see this a lot, particularly in the youth system, where kids are forever telling their same story. And I think that if we look at the theme of what we're here for about effective and humane, from the humane's perspective, nobody wants to be telling what's sometimes a very awful story to a stranger every second day. I couldn't think of anything more distressing personally. But from an efficiency perspective, which I've got a fair bit of experience in, it is highly inefficient for us to keep having to relearn what's happening with an individual, trying to get across the issues, trying to build rapport. It just doesn't work as well as it should. I'm very pleased to say in the ACT Youth Justice System, with some of the work that we've been doing, the ACT will be going to a single youth justice caseworker, and I've seen it in action in Bimberi, which I think is fantastic. The final thing, and the fifth thing that I'm positioned for us, is families. And we touched on it this morning. I very strongly believe that building and developing cohesive families is absolutely critical for helping with the reintegration, both of kids and it makes sense for adults as well. There is some evidence that if you start with the families on the outside before that there is benefit to be gained. With the supportive family can make quite a substantial difference from some of the things that we've seen, and that's about giving them the services and the support that they need to be able to function as a family, as while a member of the family is in detention. And I think, again, it was touched in the previous session, is that by doing that, we'll actually help reduce the population of the next generation. Certainly in the ACT, about 1/3 of the kids in the Bimberi Detention Centre have an adult who have been at the McConaughey Centre, which is quite disturbing because the family or the intergenerational crime issue continues. By supporting those families, we believe that we can actually try and break that. The final thing that I'd like to challenge us with, and perhaps raise in the discussion, and it has come up, I think, a little bit, we've heard this earlier this afternoon, we're all in agreement about what we're here for, but how do we get the community to see what we're doing in this area as being worthwhile? It's a very easy argument to make that being tough on crime is good for the community. It's an easy sell. I'd posit that actually that it's pretty easy to sell to say that building cohesive families is a good thing, and it's something that we should be pushing. As I like to point out, I can sell that argument to my 16-year-old very left-wing daughter as easily as I can to my 70-year-old super right-wing father. But there's a whole range of different arguments we have to make to the community, I think, to actually make sure that we're going to benefit or make these benefits clear to the community and get them to support the very good work that's being done out there. I look forward to hearing to the other panellists and to the ensuing discussion. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Peter. We come now to our panel. Leonard and Julie have already introduced themselves, but Jonathan and Graham will do so when they come to make their remarks. And first we'll hear from Leonard Atone.
Yeah, I'm still Leonard, and look, I could talk about so much, but like one of the things I do want to touch on today is that post-release from prisons is not like my idea of freedom was being released from prison. And it's one thing to be released from a physical prison, to be imprisoned mentally by whatever got you there in the first place. In my case, it was drugs, alcohol, mental health, and whatever took me there in the first place. It's a bit like drugs are a symptom of something else. Jail is a symptom of something else. And we can focus on those till the cows come home. But if you don't get to the cause of what took someone there, I mean, every time I got released from prison, I had different needs, whether it was from a youth training centre to a adult prison to an open camp to H division. My needs were different each time. And I still battle society today. You know, I'm doing a diploma in community services, trying to get a placement in an agency. Unbelievable. My past, children's checks, police checks, this, that. I mean, you're honest about your past and it's held against you. You're dishonest about your past and you're not to be trusted. And you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I mean, look, we face so much. You know, my prison, I might as well have been sentenced to life in prison. Because, you know, like I got released from prison many, many years ago, and the obstacles that are placed in front of me daily, whether it's about getting work, whether it's about socialising, invited somewhere, like my mother still doesn't. I have to take my sunglasses off before I'm allowed into her house. Not because she wants to see my beautiful eyes, but because she wants to make sure that I'm not drug affected. Because of the amount of lies I've told and the amount of stories I've told and the amount of times I've said sorry, are just like the amount of trauma we cause others. You know, you can lock me up forever, you know, like you can take me out of jail, but you can't take the jail out of me. And I mean, I use my past as experience to help others today. So I don't see it as negative, I see it as like, why wouldn't people tap into that rather than, you know, like not let me do a placement because I might be a bit risky. You know, because I might re-offend or re-use drugs, which is what drug addicts do anyway. Drug addicts, the most normal thing for a drug addict to do is to use drugs. The most normal thing for a prisoner to do is to go to prison. That's what they do. You know, like, and if we don't tackle that sort of stuff, I think that we're on the wrong track. You know, and I've been to prison once, in the last 20-something years. And the last time I went to prison was only 5.5 years ago to the date. And I was a drug and alcohol outreach worker, working with prisoners, and I got into a bit of trouble, stressed to the max, overworked, underpaid, all of the stuff that you probably all know. And I found myself, you know, in trouble with the law again. And I was locked up, you know, and I went for bail about 3 or 4 days later. And my bail was refused, not because I'd been out of jail for 20 years, but because of my past of having been to jail. And it was only like 10 days after that I went to a higher court and presented a case, and the magistrate that was there knew me, and she knew about the work I was doing, and she was interested in what happened to me. Why weren't people looking after me about what had happened to me rather than being in? And she just said to the police, the police aren't here either, I'll finish on this. And she gave me bail, you know, she gave me bail on my own reconnaissance. She said to do what I know best, do what I tell other people to do, and I've been doing it ever since. And so there is life after jail, and there is life after reoffending.
Thanks, Leonard. Jonathan Hunya.
I'm Jonathan Hunya. I'm the Principal Legal Officer at the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, which is the Aboriginal legal service for the top end of the Northern Territory. I should start with a few statistics because they're always a good way to shock an audience when you come from the Northern Territory. We heard today that in Victoria you lock up 106 per 100,000. In the Northern Territory we lock up 679 people per 100,000. So I did feel like heckling the minister last night when he said 500 new beds. I was very close to saying you're going to have to do a lot better than that, mate. And look, good luck. That's $50 million that has been committed to those new beds, and that's $50 million every year that they'll be spending, which they could be spending on something else. 80% of our prison population are Aboriginal, They are 30% of the population in the Northern Territory otherwise, but they're 80%. In the juvenile detention centre, Aboriginal kids are 90% plus of that population. We also lead the way in recidivism. Nationally, about 40% of people go back within 2 years. In the NT, it's over 47%. So one of the things that I'm particularly proud to be involved with at NAJA is what I regard as some of the positive work we do. Obviously, we spend a lot of time being quite critical, and we're seen largely as a criminal defence organisation, which is a shame. We have a large and busy civil practice. We're divided by a Chinese wall to avoid, so that we can help as many Aboriginal people as we can. And our civil team does a lot of work with victims of crime as well. But the work we do in our advocacy and projects sphere, I think, is positive, constructive work that I think is something I'm very proud of, because I think it puts us on the front foot, and it is an Aboriginal organisation that is showing great leadership, and I'm very proud to work for the Aboriginal Board and the Aboriginal CEO at NAJA. The things that we do are a prison support role. We have 2 prison support workers who are at the prison who try to work with the hundreds and hundreds of Aboriginal people there to help them both access services, access programs with welfare issues, but also to set them up for parole applications and to make sure that they're in a position to get on the front foot. They work with people to try to help them get parole, and then we have an advocacy lawyer who helps write submissions to the parole board. The natural justice is explicitly excluded from the parole system in the Territory, but we have had great luck in working with the parole board to have them open to our submissions and to be able to give us some natural justice, even though they're not required to do so. But so that's one area where I think we're on the front foot. We also provide through care service, so we have 2 where that has been expanded to 4 people who are going to work with prisoners to provide support 6 months before and 6 months after their release. It's not ideal. Through care is ideally from day 1 right through. We hope that our prison support workers can plug some of that gap, but our through care team works on 6 months before and 6 months after to try to provide that through care and that post-release support. The other thing that we do, which I'll just touch on very briefly, is the work of our community legal education section, which is working particularly on some quite innovative and exciting stuff, really much more around community development, so that the communities that we service and the remote communities where there are many social problems, but also some terrific examples of leadership, but so those communities can engage in the justice system and they can participate and be a part. So when we talk about post-release support, it's as much about supporting those communities to try to take people back. That work is a little bit in its infancy, but I'm just going to... that work is a bit in its infancy, but is as much about us asking community what they want as it is us going and telling them about the right to silence, which I think has unfortunately been much more of a feature of our CLE. I just want to touch on 3 things that I think are undermining the efforts in post-release support. One is the increase in remands. If you are on remand for a significant period of time, you don't have access to through care, you don't have access to programs. I think that's really undermining efforts and is a real problem. The increase in the jail population is also a significant problem. Not only does it reproduce prisoners, but it also creates societal damage. And I think it's Professor David Brown has talked about a tipping point where you get a stage where the high rates of imprisonment break down the societal and family bonds that would keep people out of crime, and particularly in Indigenous communities in the Territory, that's a massive problem. And the third thing is the risk paradigm, that I think there are some positive movements in the Territory, but it's harder to get people parole and supported release because of a risk aversion. I think we've had some positive developments there with our parole board. And also the approach of community corrections has very much moved in recent years to a monitoring and compliance role rather than a support role because of risk aversion. And again, that makes it very hard in a post-release support context to try to get people out and to keep them out.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Graham West, I'm the CEO of St Vincent de Paul in New South Wales and as a former Minister for Juvenile Justice in New South Wales. I know time is very short and this is such a huge thing to compact, but the first observation I'd make about post-transition support and all those things is that we really shouldn't be starting from there. I mean, we really should be starting from the fact that majority of people in our justice system shouldn't be there. In New South Wales juvenile justice, for example, half the population there are on remand. 80% of those actually won't be sentenced to a custodial sentence. So there's a serious problem there. I've said it before, but if that was a hospital where we were misdiagnosing cases 80% of the time, then this would be all across the front pages. There'd be people losing their jobs. Now, I'm not suggesting that people in the system should, because they're good people. But that's the sort of... It slipped under the radar. One of the saddest things about being Juvenile Justice Minister was the few people outside of people working in the sector who actually take an interest in the people inside. And that includes, you get very few letters from the families because they're often scared of the system themselves, as has been said. But I asked some of the juvenile justice staff, how do you measure success when people leave here? And they said, well, we measure success if we can increase the length of time it takes a young person to come back into the system. And I thought that was a pretty sad indictment. So I asked this juvenile justice officer, well, what's the solution? How can we fix it? And he picked up, part of it was humour, but part of it was actually true. He said education is one. We know that those in juvenile custody left education at 14. And the other was, he said, a non-offending girlfriend. I've said that at many forums and no one's ever offered their daughters. But I think what he was picking up is something that I've heard Patrick Dodson capture so much more eloquently. And what's missing in a lot of these debates is love. And governments don't do love. We mean well, we have good people, but we don't do love. That is in communities. So if we're actually looking at post-transition support, it's actually got community-centred and family-based, I think is a good start. And as Peter said, that's actually an intuitive message to sell to many people, but it actually also is true. And some of the programs that are being experimented with around multi-systemic therapy and family functional therapy, they're experimented here, but in the US they're actually quite established, tend to be working far better than some of our traditional approaches. And part of that reason is that they use the fact that someone's encountered the justice system as a red flag for the family, recognising that there are issues often going on within that family. And then they work with the whole family, not only helping that individual young person, but other young people that might be in the family or the whole family. And the other thing they do is, unlike traditional service delivery models where you go to a facility, it's all about you going to them. They go to you, services are wrapped around, almost available 24 hours a day with a phone call for at least a period of 6 months. And I think that brings us to the other issue around how we transition people out, is that most of our programs are very short term. When I know Professor Vinson was spoken before about community development taking many years, one of the approaches possibly we need to look at is using a CRC, a cooperative research centre type model, and actually getting longitudinal funding and tying that into a justice reinvestment framework. I've been asked many times, what is justice reinvestment? And it's not a program, it's a methodology rather. So we need programs that actually are flexible, adaptable and measurable. And that's a challenge for all of us in the sector. I think we all have intuitive views, but how we wrap that up, and that can be very challenging to do. So focusing our programs around that regard is important. The other thing is education, going back to what that juvenile justice officer said. Many of the people who have in our system have left education very early, 14 or more. Many of them, from my observation, and my background is not in education, are often visual, spatial learners and different styles of learning. My guess is that our current education system probably works for about 80% of the population, and there's 20% who struggle through it. And a small subset of those ended up in our custodial settings. What they get in a juvenile justice setting, less so in an adult setting, is a very structured program. One teacher and one teacher's aid to about 4 people. Very intense, changes around. We need those type of programs in the outside. The final thing I'll conclude on, and picking up from what Leonard and Jonathan have said, is around fear. Fear is a very easy argument to mount. There are tragic circumstances that occur every day that are abhorrent. But the harder thing, but actually the stronger thing, is hope. And we need to be giving people hope if they're going to transition out of this. Leonard was talking about going for a record check. Now, my organisation is a Catholic organisation. I wonder whether if someone like Leonard applied for a job, we did a criminal record check and it flagged up as having a criminal record, whether we'd actually sensibly take the next step, which is actually going into a risk assessment, which is what it's for, or whether we'd simply say, well, that's too easy, we'll go with the applicant who doesn't have the record. And I think that's a very difficult challenge for all of us. The other part about fear, of course, is it exists because We need to be having countervailing tendencies out there, other voices entering these debates. And in that regard, I congratulate Jesuit Social Services in their work, but also many of you in what you're doing, because it's only when we've got both sides of the debate we'll end up with something that gets us a better system.
Thanks, Graham. Now, there's someone on the speakers list called Julie Edwards, whoever she is.
Okay, thank you, Frank. I'm speaking because this is this post-release area, and that's what Jesuit Social Services has been doing, and it's a priority area of us, has been doing for nearly 35 years. And as I was listening to people, I went back in my mind to our origins, and Brosnan Youth Services is named after Father Brosnan, and if you're a Melburnian, you'll know that Father Brosnan was the chaplain at Pentridge Prison for nearly 30 years. And he said, when people get out of prison, they need three things: a place to live that's decent, a job that they can handle, and friendship. And then he went on to say, and the hardest to provide is friendship. And it's interesting to me that how pertinent that still is. They're really core issues, and they continue to shape our practice. And of course now we know that they are also backed up by the research about what people need, and whether we take up the point of love or friendship or connectedness, that's really central and what we're here to do. So I suppose at Jesuit Social Services I've been asked to say a little bit about the model that we work towards or within. And one of the key things I want to mention, it goes back to what Rod Wise said about staff, is the key thing for us is the people whom we recruit. It's the staff, fantastic staff, but and I believe that people who are drawn to this work have a vocational heart, and they're wanting to make a difference. And I think the challenge for us, whether it be in systems like child protection or in youth justice, it's about how we can create the organisational structures and frameworks to nurture that vocational heart, because I think we have fantastic people, but I think they do get hammered, and I think it's about how we do that. But then it's about recruiting people into a model, and we have a very strong model. So we recruit, induct, and then support people into a model. And we spend a lot of time over the last few years articulating that model, and it's a model that draws on our values, but is also supported by evidence. And simply put, it's about, and this isn't in a linear fashion, but about working with people to value themselves and others, building aspiration and hope, and that's come up a few times, about supporting people to deal with the various barriers that they face. So this is not so much the structural barriers, but the personal barriers. So things like mental illness or alcohol and drug addiction or homelessness, etc. Actually actively dealing with that. But also at the same time, and we've become increasingly aware of this over recent years, is building skills. And we heard a lot about education today. Corrections Victoria own data says that 94% of male prisoners have not achieved Year 12 or any post-school qualification. So just think about that. 6% of the male population in prison, only that 6% have that qualification. I think most of us know what you need to get a job. You need some qualification, even if it's quite a basic qualification. So we have that 5,500, I might be a year out of date, Rod, you might have more accurate data, 5,500 exits from prison a year. That's right, he's nodding, thank you. And think about that in terms of the data. So what we really think we do need to do is intervene at that educational and training level to do a bit of catch-up. And we think that should be resourced, given that the education system, for example, probably had a huge saving by not dealing with those people since Year 7 or earlier. So the SRPs that I'm learning about, these packages that haven't gone to them, perhaps could now go to that group of people to do a bit of catch-up. And then, of course, it's about accessing opportunities, and I think that is about Patricia Faulkner, our chair, has talked about beating a pathway to the door of employers to help them be more inclusive. So, in summing up, because I can see that tall figure rising over there, I think it is important that we have a model that draws on our values and is evidence-based, and then we support staff into that and through that for the long haul. The final thing I want to say is around advocacy, and that's what this is about. It's important that we also keep advocating, and that's what this forum's about. But we need to keep doing that because, for example, in Victoria, we now have a new post-release model that has identified packages for people who have intensive, high, medium, low needs. An intensive package, post-release package, people here might be very surprised to know, amounts to 30 hours a year. If we're going to do the good work that we're talking about here, I guess we might use that up in the first week. So while it is very good that we do have this work, these packages and this money to do the work, I think we have to be realistic about what that is going to do and what it's going to turn around. So, and that's at the high end. So I think that's part of our advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks to our panel for being so disciplined. We've now got 35, 40 minutes, so there may be some hangover issues you want to deal with on prisons or transition and post-release support. So over to you, and wait until the microphone comes, and please identify yourselves.
Firstly, thank you for to all the speakers. I've just found it extraordinary today. My name's Chris Lamming. I work at Monash Gippsland, and my area of research over the years has been men's behaviour change in terms of challenging men's violence against women and children. And because of that, I was invited this year, 3 months ago, to go to Kenya by a gender-based violence network of strong feminist organisations like Lawyers Against Human Rights, Pawani Gender-Based Violence Network. And on the first day there, I was there expecting to be, at their request, workshopping around engaging men in challenging gender-based violence. And as you can imagine, there are all sorts of types and intensities of gender-based violence in parts of Africa that we just don't ordinarily have an experience of. Child prostitution in that part of Kenya was rife. Tourism based on that, people from Europe, people from Australia, and so on. What I found myself was in a prison on the first day, being invited into the prison to sit with 19 sex offenders. And with that gender-based violence network of women workers and paralegals and these men telling their stories, out of that came a model that they've now launched of working with sex offenders in terms of reducing recidivism. Now, for me, it was mind-blowing in all sorts of ways, and I won't go into that, but what I want to put in terms of all of us is I wonder whether we can't get past, and I wonder whether the Christian message and the Jesuit message can be more than justice. I mean, justice is an Old Testament view. We're talking about compassion. We're talking about what I think Kate this morning referred to as respect, dignity, and hope. How do we do that? So many of the people who have talked today have talked about, the difference in terms of how people end up in incarceration. And here were women wanting to work with perpetrators of gender-based violence, of awful, awful violence. I think my sense in Australia is that we're light years away from that. And yet, for them, it was really about building community. It was about hope for these men. And then on the second day, we went to what they call Borstal, youth training, 15 to 18-year-old sex offenders. This was all about, for them, getting these young men back into the community so they didn't reoffend. All about building family, all about safety for the kids, for the women, and so on. Now, I just wonder whether that isn't something we could look at more. I mean, it builds up from the Truth and Justice Commissions of Tutu and and Nelson Mandela and the rest of them in South Africa and now in other parts of Africa. And yet I still see us locked into a punishment and retribution and nowhere near a forgiveness and reconciliation model at all. I don't know what other people think.
We might just leave it with the panel for a moment. Yes?
Our friend here just mentioned that justice was an Old Testament concept. Father Brosnan used to always say justice was a divine prerogative and we'll get it in the next world, not in this world. But you might be interested in the perception of justice from the point of view of an offender. There was a fellow in the jail and he said to Bros, "They've set me up. I want you to get someone to represent me." At any rate, I wasn't available, so we organised someone else, and he went in and he took instructions from this guy, and he was horrified but believed that this bloke had been set up. And he said, "Now, never mind, man, you'll be all right, we'll get justice for you." "Justice," said the offender, "that's the last bloody thing I want. I owe them 300 years if I get that."
Peter Mapson, Student Welfare Coordinator next. Again, the question of education keeps coming back, keeps hitting, and the word I used this morning was exclusion. Another word I want to use is diagnosis. Early diagnosis, it works two ways. Early diagnosis might recognise something happening, right? It should not lead to exclusion. It should lead to treatment. It should lead to being handled, something done about it at the early stage with the least disruption. The disruption that is caused following early diagnosis sometimes and the labelling process that carries on after that diagnosis is what leads to the trouble.
Graham?
Sorry. I just want to pick up on education just very briefly because I understand what you're saying, but I have a slightly different view. In what I was trying to say before is that we like to diagnose things, but many of these things actually aren't conditions that need diagnosis. They're just everyone has a different type of learning style or a different way of relating. And until we have an education system that allows people to play to their strengths, and that actually might not be the same school for all people. I think it actually... there are those who are going to respond in very different ways. And it's not about diagnosis of conditions. Yes, we should early diagnosis if that should be done. But things we used to describe as eccentricities before, we used to highly value. I worry sometimes that we actually start wanting to diagnose everything, when rather what we should be doing is saying, if there's 10 people that have this in this community, there's probably a lot in others, and let's work out how we can bring the educational needs to them, tailor around them.
Better.
We're talking about transitions, and one of the things that we've been looking at in the ACT from the work we've been doing there is around the transition from primary school to high school, and it seems that there's a lot of kids that become disengaged from education at that point. And from the JJ work that we've done, that being disengaged from education is the big marker, that there's the next one being that they really seem to get into trouble. And I think, therefore, that looking at how we support kids at risk in that transition, and most of them are boys, is something that is worth very closely looking at, I think, so that we can, again, in this sort of justice reinvestment thing, look at the front end and spend less money on the back end.
A couple of statements, I think, more than anything else. And whilst I think this has been an extraordinarily valuable exercise, for me, one critical component in this discussion is most people end up in the courts and then as a result in the prisons because police have charged them. We've had pretty much no discussion in that space. So I think that needs to be something for future because it's a critical part of the jigsaw. Yes. Secondary, picking up on the education thing, And I concur that we need to understand, and until we get to the point where we have a system that acknowledges different learning styles and approaches, and that can cater for that, then we won't have so many people disenfranchised from an education system. And let's face it, governments and society are so good at public policy. Remember, we used to have things called technical colleges, and now we have a skills shortage in this country. I'll leave that one.
Why do we need a big better schools? We have technical colleges who are perfectly fine.
Modern version of it, and it's not fair.
One and then two. Yep.
Hi, Susan Badawi from Monash University. We're doing a study at the moment in partnership with the Department of Justice and back row here, looking at older prisoners in Victoria and New South Wales. And they are actually, the over 65s are actually the fastest growing group of prisoners, both in Victoria and around Australia. A lot of the issues we've discussed today look at social disadvantage, and in a lot of cases those issues don't actually apply to that prisoner group. We're seeing that they're actually far more educated. They are usually from a higher socioeconomic status. They usually don't require a lot of the services such as literacy services and education and training services because they're in retirement age already once they get to prisons, and they face different post-release issues. So I think what I wanted to say is that for us to start thinking about people in the justice system as not a homogenous group. There are pockets within that might not necessarily be as appealing to our sense of social justice in a lot of senses, and I think that sometimes we can fall into the deserving and the undeserving criminal. And I think what I wanted to ask the panellists, and it's probably a hangover from the prison stuff, was how does a sense of humanity apply to those people in prison we might see as being less deserving?
Who on the panel would like to wrestle with that? Graham, give us a... Yeah, that's right. Give us some thoughts on inherent human dignity.
Yes, I went to a corrections stakeholder forum, and I think this was brought out, and I think the older age group, and I think John Elder did a piece in the Sunday Age about it. Question, this is a question I actually have, and Rod might be able to help us as part of the conversation, or you might be able to. Are we talking about people in that older age group largely, would there be a higher proportion of sex offenders in that? Yeah, so I thought that's what you were getting at. So, okay.
The crimes there tend to be homicide, but also a large proportion of fraud and drug offences.
Okay. So, in a sense, though, you're pointing to a challenging of, even amongst us social justice kind of people, about do we have categories of deserving and undeserving? So, for example, sex offenders, etc. I was challenged once a few years ago by Kelvin Anderson, who headed up the Corrections Victoria around what were we doing around sex offenders. I have to say, and this might be a bit controversial, it's a bit of a touchy issue for the church sometimes to be dealing with that, because members of the church have received a lot of public criticism, understandably, for being perpetrators to or how they've dealt with that. So there's another level of sensitivity there. But I know about a program, and others might know, for example, about the Quakers, who have a program where they really take on a person and say, we will look after this person in our community, and really surround that person with 24-hour care, monitoring as well. But I think that is a big challenge to us, and I think we've all got our little blind spots.
I just want to say something on like talking about sex offenders in jail. Once upon a time, if you were convicted of a sex crime, you were like, it wasn't a nice place to be. But today, if you're a sex offender and you've got access to drugs, you can be the main man in a prison. if people understand what that means. Like, your sex offence does not matter. If there's something that other people can get out of you, I mean, that's the world that... I mean, I've done a lot of work in the prison system, and I mean, it's horrifying, even to have experienced it myself, to be sentenced to 4 years imprisonment and to be running a heroin habit in the prison system, meaning getting visits every week, getting heroin inside the prison every week, using syringes that I won't need to go into, and like hoping the heroin lasts me from Saturday to Saturday and it runs out every week, Wednesday or Thursday, be sick as a dog Thursday and Friday, and it's never occurred to anyone that I might be running a habit. Little things like that happen daily, and I work in the Mums for Youth Training Centre. Like, they go out on weekend leaves, they bring back whatever they want to bring back, they hide it on the grounds, they do all sorts of things, you know. And you go and run a group, and there's someone hanging out in the middle of a group, you know, withdrawing 4 days into a habit. So, you know, like, I don't know if I've touched on anything there, but the prison system is not a place where, you know, like you can talk about and you can put things in place where they run to schedule. The only time a prison is organised is mealtime and medication time. That's it. And maybe visiting time. And that's pretty chaos then.
Yes.
My name's Arthur Bolkus. Like my friend Leonard here, I'm an ex-prisoner too. I've also worked for too many years in the so-called criminal justice system and with prisoners. I think a more appropriate term for this symposium isn't what would a humane and effective criminal justice system look like. It really should be, what would a humane and effective society look like? Because the criminal justice system is a part of society, and I sometimes think it's a really naive expectation when we talk about the correctional system that we really believe that at the end of the line that this prison system is going to somehow fix people, rehabilitate people. For goodness sakes, it's impossible. When people ask me, Arthur, what do you think we need to do to address the rising imprisonment rates, the number of young people who are falling into addiction, which is why they end up in prison these days, I say fix the family. But then how do you fix the family? How do you legislate for it? How do you pay for it? Who has the wherewithal to do it? That, to me, is where the problem starts. And until we find a way to fix the family, I think the criminal justice system is going to be like an increasingly leaky ship, which is doomed to sink. And the only reason I stay in this work isn't because I love it, as if I have some sort of an affinity for prisoners or ex-prisoners. I hate going into prisons. I hate working with them in the sense that they make me relive so many memories, and I find the work stressful and soul-destroying at times, and really costly. Why do? I do it because it's the right thing to do, because that's what a decent human being would do, because my faith tells me that that's what I should do, and so I do it, sometimes begrudgingly. Which brings me to Father John Brosnan, whom I had the pleasure of meeting one day in a really difficult spot. I'd just become a Christian in prison after 4 years, having contemplated killing myself a few nights before, and then reading a Bible and having something happen that I'm still trying to come to terms with. And standing outside the classification office, waiting to go before them on a drug-related charge that had occurred 2 weeks before, and wanting to go into my usual mode of lying and manipulation, but being conflicted with what I'd read in the Bible the night before in my cell, you know, you shouldn't lie and stuff. And Father John Brosnan walked past at that point. I think it was a divine meeting, and he looked at me and he said, "Hello, young man, how are you?" And it was like God spoken to me. And God was saying, go in there and tell the truth. And I did. And it all turned out well. And I have a lot of respect for Father John Brosnan, and I agree with what he said, that prisoners need those three things when they're coming into the community. But in my experience, it's not just about getting them somewhere decent to live, important though it is. And it's not just about getting them a job, because I've found that with a lot of them, it's helping them to keep the job because they don't know how to work. But the third one, and the most important one, the friendship, that is the most critical one of all, because that is the costliest one of all for us in the community. For the people who presume to have the answers, for the people who have an expectation that these prisoners, these offenders, these reprobates, these antisocials should sort of step into our world, we then, with that expectation, need to reach across that chasm to step into the space because they don't know how. So we need to embrace them. And I guess the word, if I can finish with this, the word that resonates for me today more than any other word when it comes to prison reform and rehabilitation and all that is community, but not a token community. Because what I see in here so often is token community. It's ticking the boxes. It's appearing to be doing what we should be doing. But when it all comes down to reality, we don't personally engage them. We don't befriend them. And that's what they need more than anything else. How many of the people here today, good people that you are, doing what you do, working in this sector, it's really difficult. With all your knowledge and experience, how many of you have a personal relationship with one of these people? Well, that's great. And maybe that's because this is a Christian forum. A lot of you are Christians or have some sort of ethical, moral kind of basis for what you do. But you know, in a lot of other forums, the experts do their jobs. They run their programs, they provide a service, but they don't provide community in the incarnational sense. And that's why, if I can give a plug, this T-shirt, 5'8", for prisoners, you'd know it. What does that mean, Leonard? My mate, my best friend, my mate. It's a little ministry that my wife started a couple of years ago to support a guy who was doing 8 years, who was in a protection prison because of the nature of the crime, who had no one visiting him, not even his mother. She'd given up on him. And my wife said, he needs visitors. And I said, well, go and find some. So she went to church the following week, stood up and said, who is prepared to come and visit this guy? 3 people put their hand up. 5'8" was born. Today, it supports about 11 prisoners by getting 4 to 6 volunteers together who give a damn, visit the inmate, provide all the support that friends and family do, but more importantly, most importantly, when they return to the community, are part of that person's community and spend time and spend resources and open their lives in real, unconditional friendship. And that's what I think we need. Thank you.
One, and then two. Yep. Oh, sorry. One, two, three.
Sorry about that. I'm Carol Nikakis, CEO of VACRO. It's been a fantastic conversation over the last today and last night. I'd just like to go back to the issue of sex offenders because VACRO is running a program with the department in partnership with the department at Corella Place. And what we're seeing there is a really good program that supports the people in the program as well as supporting safety within the community. And I think it's very important that the community realises that the department and VACRO and everyone else who cares about the people in Corella Place knows that they are being supported to transition, to have social engagement that's monitored and is safe. And I think what we need to always consider is that the people in Corella Place have a background that is very traumatic, and I think if people could read their case histories, they would understand how they ended up in that position, and they are survivors as well. And I think we do need to show compassion for the people who are in that situation, as well as always considering community safety.
Thank you for your story. What strikes me all along the line is we're talking about people post-release or during their time in prison or whatever, changing their lives. But you can't really program that. You were lucky. As you walked at that moment, there was Brozzy, who was very direct in what he would say to people. Just reminds me of, in the 70s, I was working in adult literacy at a time when the general population thought either you were a migrant or you had a mental disability. No, they were people who went to our schools. And so there was a bit of a paper campaign on that, and we were being interviewed on a group of us, and among them was one of my students from the Council for the Single Mother and her child. And she was being asked by the professionals, why? Oh yes, they were talking about the evil thing called testing. You wouldn't test these people because that would terrify them. This was the assumption of the professionals. And she kept saying, no, I wanted to be tested, I wanted to be tested. And when asked why, she said, because then I would fail and they would have to help me. That's always stuck in my mind, as at that moment, it helped us too, because we had an idea. So how do we then, in practical terms, but I'm also Wayne's comment about the police, we simply can't leave them out of this whole system. It is the police who arrest. It is the police who have the database of all the people round about. When something happens, it's probably so-and-so. If you have a physical attribute that aligns you with something like that, you are very likely to be hauled in. And that in itself is terrible. So that is also pulling back against whatever change you might be trying to make in your life after you leave prison. So I'm just wanting to throw that into... I've been sort of wanting to... I keep thinking there's something wrong here. We need to include them. I would have liked to have asked the Neighbourhood Justice Centre if, when they have their conferences, do they include the arresting officer or someone who... Because they are there in court listing all the crimes, which very often are a bit incomprehensible to the layperson, including the offender. But they need to be very much part of seeing there is this willingness and so on to change. So I just put that, you can't create the will to change in anyone, but you can try in various ways, and yes, friendship and so on, and reaching out and being brave enough to say things. You can try and create a context for it. Thank you.
Peter.
We've had a couple of things about police come up, and they're gathered not represented here. And my company's done a fair bit of work for police as well, and as a former army officer, I suppose I have some kinship there, although as Graham would tell you that it doesn't necessarily extend as far as it might. But police have a very difficult job. There's no two ways about it. Some policing practices are very much counterproductive to helping people actually rehabilitate. And certainly in New South Wales, we saw the actions of the New South Wales Police Service with targeting kids, particularly meant that they were being locked up far more often than they need to. That said, there are very good instances of police action that can assist, and I note in the ACT policing, which is a part of the Australian Federal Police, actually having programs with Indigenous kids in particular, where they pick them up at home after they've been bailed, pick them up and take them to the programs that they need to get to, because public transport in the ACT is so poor, so that they can actually make sure that they make their conditions and therefore reduce the likelihood of them having to breach them on bail. So there are good programs out there. Police are an important part of the equation. I think it's how do we engage them to see that it's in their best interest, in the long-term interest, to do something or to change their behaviour so that we get those sorts of outcomes as we see in the ACT.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about transition. I wanted to sort of bring it back. So, like I said earlier, I work for the Metropolitan Remand Centre. We're increasingly noticing that guys are being released on a Saturday or on a Sunday. What does that say for the availability of services? You're releasing guys who have potentially been in custody for quite some time, because we know remand time is going up, and then they're getting out on a Saturday. They can't get to Centrelink payments. We don't even necessarily get enough time to give them the transitional support before they're released. And especially for those without housing, there's not even much housing available or the services open for them to get that availability. So I guess to bring it back to a practical point, maybe there just needs more communication between the parole boards and the courts, and the courts need to understand a little bit better about the services. It's quite simple, really. Just keep them in on a Monday and we can sort it out. But yeah.
Sure. Now there are two others who had hands up to comment, so I'll get those and then come back to the panel for a final. No, so we'll hear from these two first and then come back to the panel. Okay. So here and then up the back.
My name's Alan Breichel. I know a lot about justice, legality, other things. I agree with what you've just said. I remember seeing that happen. It should actually be written down somewhere, because I think that's quite an easy thing that could be implemented. For sure, there's no problems about that. The lady over there, I was happy to see her put it to Bob in, because I agree with her entirely. I did speak with her shortly, or last night. I spoke to Frank Vincent, who I know quite well. On the 2nd of November 1995, I boxed him into a corner with two other eminent justices in the Court of Criminal Appeal. I got unconvicted by a corrupt police officer doing the work for Mrs. Kerner and others, including their former assistant, in my opinion. Got to be careful here, legally, of Bob Faulkner, the Assistant Commissioner of Police, who framed me in 1991 to shut me up because I did bring down the government. Look, I think that the police need to be more proactive, and that the conference leaders' approach value. He's got still young kids, I think. If you don't get it right this time, you can forget it for the rest of this century. And that there should be set up a youth club run by uncorruptible police members, as there was in the past. If I remember correctly, I was speaking to Frank about it. There was a police club or something back in the 60s, because there was a lot of young little hoodlums, including me, I suppose, running around Melbourne. I didn't go there, I played hockey. Now, of course, it really has to be done by dedicated police who hopefully, and one of the big problems they've got in the police force is, as an old Liberal once told me when I was in the Liberal Party, he said, Alan, he rang me up because I was having problems with the police, of course, and he said, Alan, you've got to understand that you need criminals to catch criminals, because we don't think like the criminals. And I think you'd agree with that, and so would you.
Excuse me, Alan.
So that's what I was just saying.
One more minute.
They should be trained.
Could we have just one more minute, please?
So that's what I think. There should be. You've got to talk and do the walk, the same language. And unfortunately, the police are, many of them, in my opinion, pseudo criminals. There's no doubt about it. And they're the ones that they're the coalface. If I talk about nuts and bolts, that's the coalface. Now, I may be incorrect, it's only my opinion, but I've got a lot more experience than most of you people will ever have. If you check me out on Google, on internet, you'll see who I am. And actually, I've just been sacked from the job because of who I am, only about an hour and a half, 2 hours ago. And they've tried to say that I've stolen a gas monitor, which didn't happen. And it's actually quite hurting now, because I was making about 3,500 to 4,000 a week gross. Right. Okay, so that's it. I'm just...
Thank you.
So
and
you
the
know-
last one up the back. There we are.
Thank you very much. In fact, everyone is looking at me, but I'm sorry, my accent may be difficult for the moment, but you will understand me. All from the morning up to now, we are discussing for the same problem. We have a problem, really. We stated so many solutions, preventive, restoration, all these sorts in order to cure our problem. But I will suggest or propose an idea, because we didn't touch that. If anything happens that there is a problem, we should come back to the sources. If we come back to the sources, we can solve the problem. What is this problem for? I think three things shapes a person in his life. One is family, as stated before. The other is education, school. The third is the environment. Now, shall we come to see or to evaluate our system of education? A curriculum is very important for a nation. So I think we have to come back to our curriculum in our schools and to evaluate it and to put some subjects which are not there. For instance, ethics.
We just have one more minute.
Please.
One more minute, please. Just 1 minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ethics, moral, logic, philosophy, and so on. If we do that, human rights and so forth, then the curriculum will appear very nice, and we will create a very nice generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, just a couple of minutes. Any member of the panel who'd like to make observations on the last few remarks that have been offered? Graham.
I'd just like to pick up particularly on the one about exiting prison. Yes, it makes sense not to be on a Saturday, but in New South Wales, Vincent de Paul runs a number of homeless services. We're getting about 30 a month referred from either mental health facilities or from prisons directly to our homeless services. So it's not just simply about the day they release, it's actually people exiting the prison system or the mental health system without actually having the supports of systems in place. And for a start, that should have been a conversation that someone had when they first entered. We do know that many people in prison are homeless to begin with, so we should actually have that information and start planning from there, because we're actually struggling to keep up with the numbers that we're getting referred from the prison system.